All right, so today we're going to be looking at the theoretical perspectives. This is the most important stuff that you're going to need to know throughout this entire year. So you definitely want to pay attention to these things. So as we go along, I will make sure that I highlight some of the stuff that you really need to know. So first off, here's some key concepts you need to know. These are addressed in the book. They're also addressed throughout this lesson, so you can get to them pretty quickly. So first off, the role of theoretical perspectives. Why do we have them? First off, it's to simplify things. Okay, it makes it very easy for us to organize things in a way that's more understandable than just writing down a bunch of facts. But a theoretical perspective is a set of assumptions about an area of study. Supporters do consider this perspective true and use it to organize their research. So they will take a set of assumptions, a theoretical perspective, and base their entire findings on these assumptions. Okay, so they don't look at every key aspect, but they're looking at these set of assumptions and how these things fall into those assumptions in the perspective. Usually there are conflicting perspectives. We'll see that in sociology. A example of this is general relativity versus the Big Bang Theory. Okay, this is Einstein, general relativity versus the Big Bang Theory that matter just happened and things just happen. So there's conflicting perspectives, and some people can prove both of them. We look at these three perspectives in sociology and just see how they line up, and they do conflict with one another, and they do have different things, but there are some things that they share. The three sociological perspectives are functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interaction. So we're going to be looking at those three. But before we do that, we need to know the 5 key concepts of sociology. What is it are the things that we organize our perspectives around? They are functional integration, social structure, power, social action, and culture. So looking at these, functional integration, it refers to the interdependence among the parts in a social system. Each part contributes to make the whole system function. Okay, so this is the whole central idea to the perspective of functionalism, and we'll cover that. But symbolic interaction and conflict theory do have these as well. So this idea of every part of a society is dependent upon each other, that if you change one, you can change them all. So we'll look at the next one. Social structure. That is the pattern of social behavior in a group or society. Framework for society. It establishes the ways that people and groups are related. And this is how we organize things based upon your location or status within that social structure. Some would view things like the old system of kingdoms in Europe, where you have a king, you have lords, you have vassals, you have peasants, and the way you line up, the way that you are built into that social structure, you're born into it. You can look at India and the caste system and how their social structure is very rigid and you can't move up and down. Whereas in the United States, our social structure is fluid. You can go from being a poor person and make it up into the upper class. You can go from upper class and be brought all the way down to a peasant, into a poor person. So the way that we look at this is the basic institutions, the social institutions that organize ways in which society meets the basic needs. So in the United States, our basic social institutions are family, economy, religion, education, law, and politics. And we'll look at how if you change something in one, you change something in the other ones. This is central concept in functionalism and the conflict theory. The idea of power is how does one person or one party or group of people influence the others? All right, what is it that they do to ensure that it will benefit from the actions of other parties? How do they keep that party down? And that's what we'll look at mainly in the conflict theory, but you do have this also in the other two perspectives as well. Social action is the way in which someone's actions are coordinated with his or her environment. How do we really base upon how do we base our actions? How do we base the way we do things? It is the central concept in symbolic interactionism. Culture. Is incorporated in all three of these. Culture is the language, norms, values, beliefs, knowledge, symbols, and physical objects that are shared by members of a society or group. So these are things that you could say you have an American culture and you have countercultures, which we'll cover later on. But you're looking at how people believe and what is it that we base our beliefs on. And we'll look at how the United States beliefs and values can differ. And even within the United States, you have different beliefs and values and norms and symbols that different people follow. But in sociology, we'll look at how these are incorporated through all three of the major theoretical perspectives. So getting right into it, the three perspectives. First one, functionalism. This emphasizes the contributions or functions of each part of a society. How do each of them contribute to society functioning? How is it that they interact together? How do they interact separately? And how, when people are in these different groups, how do they behave? What determines their behavior? Do their values change? So we look at all these things from a perspective of how are these different parts contributing to each other and to society as a whole. Change in one can lead to change in others. The example of this is the Industrial Revolution. How did it affect home life? You used to have it to where people were self-sufficient and they farmed and they lived away from cities. Okay, and then the Industrial Revolution came along, and all of a sudden you have people who are now living in cities. You have the rise of big businesses. You have the elite becoming more elite, and you have families turning into more of a smaller unit. Okay, you don't have as many kids being born because on the farms they needed more kids, and they needed more people to work the farm. This assumes that societies, in functionalism, it assumes that societies tend to return to a state of stability after some upheaval has occurred. We look at the 1960 Civil Rights Movement and how the protests and riots caused some disturbance in society, all right, caused some change to happen, but in reality, these protests and rioting that happened still went back to a stable form of society. You still had people who would be poor. You still had people who would be discriminated against. So while it did cause some change, stability did come back after the protests and riots in the 60s were over. Most aspects of society exist to promote a society's survival and welfare. All right, that is what functionalism believes, that most of what we do is only there to survive. It is there for the best interest of our society as a whole. We can look at laws and we can look at customs and things like that to where we keep society's survival and welfare at the front in functionalism. Now, with that said, there are two kinds of functions. Manifest functions, these are intended and recognized. All right, these are functions that we see, and this is the reason for this happening. For example, in school, teach math skills. Okay, you know that. When you go to school, you know you're going to learn math. You know you're going to learn reading and writing and all these things that you are required to do. But there are also things that are latent functions. This is unintended. These are unrecognized. For example, in school, it is not the purpose of school. It is not the function of school for you to develop close friendships. But they happen. All right, so these are latent functions. We also have dysfunctions. These are negative consequences of an aspect of society. These are things that, don't benefit society really. For example, in government, there are dysfunctions, inefficiency and impersonality. When you go to a government building, they're not there really to be personal with you. They're not there to really make your day better. The other day, I had to take my son to the doctor. And what was crazy is you go to the doctor and you got to go in there for an appointment. You make an appointment. You get there. And all of a sudden, you have to wait 15 minutes. Even though your appointment says 1, you're waiting out there till 1:15, 1:20 until they call you back. And that is a very small, minor dysfunction. But in life, that's a negative consequence. It's inefficient. Doctors, for some reason, just don't have that timeline with them that some of us do. So according to functionalism, there is a consensus on values. Okay, values are these broad ideas that most people in society consider to be desirable. These values influence your social behavior, how you act, how you behave. Core American values for us, I listed them below, but these are just some things that we look at as Americans and say, this is core to what we believe. And we can see right now in society how some of these are being maybe challenged by some groups. And we'll look at this when we start talking about deviant behavior and when is it necessary to be deviant. And so the question that you need to think about is how could these values conflict with one another in core American values? How could they just in general conflict with one another? This brings us to our conflict perspective, talking about conflicting with one another. It emphasizes conflict, competition, change, and constraint within a society. Basically what they're saying is that at all times there is disagreement among various groups and even between societies in general, where there will be a conflict and they are challenging each other for this idea of power. And we can look right now, very simple, Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter. These two groups that are constantly going head to head right now on social media. And we can look at that and say, okay, how is it that these are making constraint or change within our society? Social living is a contest. Okay, that's what the conflict perspective teaches. It is a contest. When you're out there living, it is a contest, and who or what group gets what. Those who are in power, they control the behavior of others. All right, and they get the largest power. Okay, they get the largest share. Those in power get the largest share because they do control the behavior. They can limit the less powerful groups. They can set ceilings on them. There's a term in the world that's called the glass ceiling, and we say that some women, or women in general, have a glass ceiling of how high they can climb within our society. And some people disagree with that, but it is a proven fact that there is some limits that we have that people enact or get into, that they don't have the same amount of ability as those above them. As the balance of power shifts, change does occur. I just talked about women, but the women's movement did open up jobs and occupations that were usually limited to men. There's a show called Ad Men, and advertising back in the 1950s was very limited to men, and they focused on when they were making advertisements, what did men react to? When in reality, women most of the time are the ones shopping. They're the ones who buy things, even for their men. So they eventually women were able to get into those limited occupations. It also focuses more on dysfunction than the positive aspects of society. All right, they look at the internet and social media and how the internet and social media may influence poorly on people, how the internet has made people maybe lazy, and how social media constantly causes conflict within groups, within societies. And we can look at how the mechanizing work in factories, it did lead to people losing their jobs, which maybe when people lose their jobs could lead to a rise in crime. So conflict perspective would see how these things interact within this constraint and within this dysfunction. The final one is symbolic interactionism. All right, it focuses on the actual interaction of people. All right, it is very micro sociology. Macro is the first two. It's looking at societies as a whole and big groups. Symbolic interaction is more concerned with the social psychological dynamics of individuals who interact in small groups. So it's looking smaller. Symbols, this is what symbolic interaction really bases their stuff on, are symbols. It's something that is chosen to represent something else. If you see a cross on somebody's neck, you know that means they are most likely Christians. It is a symbol of Christianity. Abstract is the expressing of a quality or characteristic apart from any specific object or instance. For example, the school mascot, while we look at our school mascot as representing our school, the Conner Cougars, it can also represent one of our another value. It could represent loyalty to some, like that's our mascot, we're going to rally behind it, but it's more abstract than it is, that's a Conner Cougar. What's important with symbols is symbols are meaningless except to those who create and use the symbols. All right. The book used the example of whistling. I'm going to use the example of the evolution of the swastika. Where it used to mean hope and peace and things like that, it evolved because then a group like the Nazis took it over. They made it represent something else. And now the entire world sees the swastika as a symbol of hate and discrimination and genocide and everything that's wrong with